right, here we go. And good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Key with this year's Triangle InfoSeCon 2020. I hope you all are having an awesome Friday, and thank you for attending this year. I know this year has been pretty trying for everyone, so we're definitely going to make the best of it out of it today. And today we will be joined by one of our awesome IT security professionals by the name of Jeff Foresman. He's a VP of Security Operations and CISO at Digital Hands. He has been in the IT security field for over 25 years and has held key management positions and leading high performance teams in a variety of service providers, global consulting organizations, and cybersecurity startups. So basically, he is that guy when it comes to IT security. So everybody, if you don't mind, please welcome Jeff Foresman.
Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. I actually had the opportunity to speak at this conference about 4 or 5 years ago in person, and very happy to be back with everyone. So I'm going to jump right in here, though, in the interest of time. So our agenda today, we'll do some introductions, which we covered. We'll do a little bit of level setting, make sure we're all on the same page from a cloud security standpoint. I then want to talk about the threats that we face in cloud security. We'll review some past cloud data breaches, but the most important part of this is the prevention and detection of cloud security incidents. A little bit more though, today's goals. We want to educate you guys on what your options are in the cloud security area. We want to talk about the threats and past breaches so we can learn from those. And really the bulk of this presentation is going to be looking at what AWS and Azure has as native security tools. And then a note, this is not intended to be a DevSecOps presentation. This is really more about what tools are available to prevent and detect in the native AWS and Azure environments. So let me start off here. This is my level set. You may or may have not noticed that the title of this didn't say breaches, it said incidents. And I want to explain that a little bit because I think it sets up this presentation very well. First of all, the definition of the word breach. Make a gap in or break through. My premise is when we give the data away through a misconfiguration or error, is it really a breach at that point? So I just want you to look at it in a little bit different light here, because we think about breach, we think about bad people hacking into systems. In many cases, when we look at the examples of these breaches, it's been through human error that has caused this data to be made public. And so that is a very different scenario than what we've all grown up with. As we opened up with, I've been doing security for a very long time, but we have to have a different approach for cloud security. And that's really what we'll look at today. So what are the threats we have? Well, first of all, I want to make sure you understand who is your adversary, because that has changed dramatically over the years. No longer do we have some kid in the basement hacking for fun and notoriety. You are competing against very well-funded organizations, whether it's organized crime, whether it's corporate espionage groups or state-sponsored organizations. These are professionals that are well-trained and well-funded. And if they want you bad enough, they'll get you. So you're probably aware of that. But let's look at, before we get too deep, who's responsible in the cloud world? In any cloud security presentation you go to, you're going to have this type of chart. And most of you probably understand this, but for those that don't, please make sure when you're looking at your cloud journey, when you're making decisions on a cloud solution, that you understand what it is you're buying. Are you buying an infrastructure as a service? Are you buying software as a service? Because your requirements, your responsibilities vary greatly depending on what it is you've contracted with. So we'll get into this slide in more detail later on, but understand there's very different responsibilities depending on the cloud solutions that you move forward with. The other thing I want to look at here is some statistics and really to understand how big is this problem that we're dealing with. First of all, IDC put out a recent survey. They said 79% of companies experienced at least one cloud data breach in the past 18 months. So that's a kind of a scary statistic, that almost 80% of the companies had at least one data breach. 43% of those companies surveyed said they had 10 or more cloud data breaches in the last 18 months. And then this was really a Gartner statistic that was published by the Wall Street Journal, but 95% of cloud data breaches occurred due to human errors, such as configuration mistakes. And then finally, from Oracle's threat report, 59% of companies had privileged cloud accounts compromised through spear phishing attacks. A lot of organizations are worried about their users and phishing attacks, but they don't necessarily think about that impacting their cloud environments, and it very much does. Top 3 cloud security issues that IDC found. Number 1, security misconfiguration. Number 2, lack of visibility. Number 3, improper IAM configurations. And so I'm really going to use this list as we go forward to look at what has happened in these 3 categories in the past and how do we prevent and detect attacks, really focused on these categories. This is what the survey found. This is also what I've seen in my practice working with customers in the field. So let's go back and look at some data breaches. And I've often used this quote in presentations, but I think it is very important in our industry to understand the history, understand what's happened, understand past data breaches. So many times I see organizations moving forward with projects to better secure their environments and their beliefs, but it has nothing to do with current breaches or attacks. And yet I'll see that those same organizations are not addressing things like vulnerability management, like identity management, like the common areas that we're seeing attacks originate from. So I think it's very important to go back and look. So I've got, I think I've got 4 or 5 here that we'll look at real quickly. The first one, this one goes back to 2014, but I think it's required if you do a cloud security presentation, you need to talk about code spaces. This is an extreme example, but anyways, code spaces had a denial of service attack and a breach. What's unique about this is the hackers, they gained access to their AWS EC2 control panel and removed all of CodeSpace's user accounts. They had complete control of their AWS environment. They presented CodeSpaces with extortion demands. The problem was CodeSpaces thought that they could recover on their own. Once the attackers saw the attempt to recover, they took more drastic action at that point, removed all of their S3 buckets, snapshots, and backups. So CodeSpaces had no access to any of their data or their customers' data. And CodeSpaces went out of business. It was just too expensive for them to recover. Now, we could have a long discussion about whether they should have paid the extortion demands, whether they shouldn't have, but this is a real life example of an organization that is no longer around. Actually, if you go to CodeSpace's old websites, you'll find a news site. They're no longer in existence because of this attack. Another one that I like to talk about, And this is really focused around misconfiguration. Accenture back in 2017, they left 4 of their S3 storage buckets unsecured. The result of that is people gained access to that data. It included their API data, digital certificates, decryption keys, and customer data. This was also had a big impact to not only Accenture, but a lot of Accenture's clients. And it was a simple misconfiguration in their console. And we'll take a look at how they could have easily prevented that. We also want to talk about misconfiguration from a database standpoint. So AutoClerk, which is owned by Best Western last year, left an unsecured Elasticsearch database online. And that included customer booking details, as well as other information about those customers. The particularly scary thing about this is they handled a lot of military, government, and homeland security reservations. So there was some government data here, or members of our government and military that were released as part of this. And it all came down to a simple database that was not secured. And then misconfiguration of a web application firewall. You probably guessed if I was going to go back and look at past data breaches, cloud data breaches, I would talk about Capital One. This was a breach that started as a result of a misconfigured web application firewall. Very common vulnerability, server-side request forgery. And Capital One lost 30 gigabytes of application data when their server was accessed. This affected about 1 million people in the US and 6 million people in Canada. Simple misconfiguration of a security control. And then finally, I don't want you to think I forgot about Microsoft. They had their own internal breach last year. Again, an Elasticsearch database was discovered by researchers to be open to the public internet with no encryption, about 250 million entries with Microsoft customer information in it. And a simple misconfiguration of Azure security rules caused this situation. So those are some examples. As you can see, they're all related to human error. So let's talk about how do we prevent this? First of all, everything we went through there was preventable, and it's really preventable through common security controls. We have a set of cloud security standards, multiple organizations that produce cloud security standards. I'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of these breaches that we saw were from a lack of standards and a lack of standards monitoring. You can have all the standards you want, but if you're not monitoring for adherence to those, doesn't do any good, right? Also, many of these breaches could have been addressed through an identity solution, multi-factor authentication solution. And then I said we weren't going to make this a DevSecOps presentation, but common DevSecOps practices to identify vulnerabilities in a configuration, to have testing and scanning in place, also would have prevented these breaches. So let's drill into those things a little more detail. One of the cloud security standards out there is the Center for Internet Security. They provide benchmarks for over 100 different configuration guidelines covering over 25 vendors. Really all the major cloud security systems are included in these security standards. There are other organizations that also produce standards. The reason I point these out, as you'll see here in a minute, we have the ability to do monitoring in AWS and Azure to these configuration standards. So you saw this chart earlier. What I wanted to do was bring it back though and show you that those additional columns are related to the CIS controls, and benchmarks are available for just about all of those different areas. So if you make a decision to purchase infrastructure as a service, you have some responsibility around host infrastructure network controls. There are cloud security standards that you can use, benchmarks that are readily available that can be applied to your environments. And then, as you'll see here in a minute, we have the ability to then monitor to those standards. So here's the first example. This is from AWS and their Security Hub product. And we'll drill into this a little bit more later in the presentation. But as you can see, in those boxes are specific requirements under the standard, and it shows whether you are compliant or not compliant to each of those standards. And it will update you and alert you when you go from being compliant to being not compliant. Example, someone going in and making a configuration change, not understanding how it's going to impact the environment. This would then warn you that something has changed in the environment and that control is no longer compliant. So really simple. Apply the standards, put a tool like this in place to monitor for adherence to those standards, and then you can quickly identify those misconfigurations. And we'll go much deeper as we go forward here. Not to forget, those of you that are at an Azure environment, the Azure Security Center. Now, this is not Azure Sentinel, their SIEM product. This is the Azure Security Center. So this is a product that you can install, very inexpensive, consolidates security alerts, and then lets you know when you're in compliant or out of compliance with those security standards. And you can see here, there are multiple standards that you can pick. You can pick a CIS standard. If you fall under PCI DSS, you can use that. ISO, SOC standards, there's a list of different standards you can adhere to. We mentioned earlier, identity and access management solutions. Both AWS and Azure provide various IAM tools, and specifically because there's been so many problems with things like S3 buckets being left public, there are tools in place. You can see a screenshot there on the right where it will come out very clearly and tell you when you've left a S3 bucket accessible to the internet. So these tools are readily available, very inexpensive, as most things in AWS and Azure are, but they'll clearly let you know when you have a configuration issue. And then the last thing I really want to talk about on the DevSecOps piece is just the development process here. And a lot of you are aware that the advantage of the DevSecOps approach is we're addressing security early in the design phase. We're doing threat modeling to identify threats, and we're putting a system out that's secure by design. But we have the capability to automate a lot of these things. And that map on the right there is an example for an AWS environment of how, as you're going through the development process, you can run scans or testing against your code. It will identify areas that are not compliant. And then the two examples there, it'll send an alert to Security Hub for your security engineer, or it'll send the report to your developer so they can correct the code. But this is something that is an automated process, and those alerts or reports automatically are generated for whoever needs to consume and correct those configuration errors. So now we'll get in more specifically on detection. Couple notes here. Prevention solutions are obviously not always going to be successful. We have to have the ability to detect this. In my opinion, many SIM solutions and managed security providers out there are not well equipped to support cloud environments. Their approach to cloud monitoring and detection is the same as the old school corporate data center monitoring, where they're going to put an agent on a server and that's how they're going to monitor it. We have to be able to monitor the cloud provider's environment, not just the host environments. The good news is most public cloud platforms provide a lot of tools for us to handle monitoring and even response actions. I've chose to focus mainly on AWS and Azure in the interest of time. Google has a lot of the same tools, or they are in the process of rolling out very similar tools. So the first one I want to talk about is AWS GuardDuty. And this is a really unique product. And my short description of it is, think of it as intrusion detection for inside the AWS environment. It's doing threat detection of the AWS cloud, monitoring AWS accounts, and monitoring critical logs, things like CrowdTrail logs, VPC flow logs, DNS logs. And it will identify threats in your environment. It also has the ability to take action against those threats. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. But essentially what it does is it's an intrusion detection system for what's going on inside the AWS environment. This is a screenshot of the console. You can see some sample alerts that happen there and the detail over at the side. Really does a great job of identifying attack patterns and threats. And honestly, I think far better than what we're seeing in a lot of SIM platforms today. Quite frankly, I think AWS knows, or Azure knows, the threat a lot better in their environments than many outside vendors. And so we've seen great success with using these tools to identify specific threats inside the cloud platform. I mentioned remediation earlier. Here's a perfect example. So we get a GuardDuty finding. That generates a CloudWatch event, which then invokes a Lambda function. It takes a look at currently blocked hosts in a database table, and then it adds a block to either the WAF and or the access control list. And then it can send an email out to let you know what was done, or an alert to Security Hub. So this is no human interaction. We identify a particular event. We can take action to block, whether it's an IP address or a URL, and then we notify that something happened. And this is surprisingly easy to build in AWS. All right, the next piece that I wanted to talk about here is Security Hub. And I mentioned it earlier, but this is the console where all the AWS security alerts come into, as well as the configuration checks and alerts for non-compliance. It does support GuardDuty, and it supports Amazon Inspector, the IAM Analyzer that I had a screenshot earlier of, Macy, the AWS Firewall, and then there are a number of third-party companies that have built or are building integrations into Security Hub. So if you've got a Palo Alto firewall in your AWS environment, it can integrate with Security Hub, and those alerts can come in here as one example. And then I mentioned earlier, it has these automated security checks that are going to run on a predetermined schedule and let you know when something is out of compliance to those standards. This is a screenshot of a Security Hub console. You can see here we're not in compliance, or we are in compliance with a password policy. If something changes, then that would go from pass to fail. And we would get that alert in Security Hub, and then anything that is monitoring Security Hub. A lot of people ask about cost, and I said a couple times, this is a really low cost solution. Security Hub will actually estimate what your cost is going to be. First 30 days is free, but as you're using it, it will actually generate an estimated cost. Now, this was not a very busy environment that we were testing this in. But you can see the total estimated cost was going to be $1.58. I've probably seen this to cost, and I'll say an quote unquote average company, $10, $20, $30 a month to run this tool. So as AWS has done with a lot of their tools, very, very inexpensive. The other tool I wanted to show you, the last one on AWS, and then we'll dig into Azure, is AWS Detective. So you've got GuardDuty, that's an intrusion detection system for AWS. You've got Security Hub that consolidates your alerts and brings together your compliance pieces. Detective is what can be used to do investigations and threat hunting and so forth. And the best way to show you this is just show you a few examples. So here's an example of a failed API calls out of norm. The average line there is the blue line. We all of a sudden saw a sharp increase. And then that was followed by a sharp increase of successful API calls. Does not take a genius to figure out that that could have been malicious. A malicious attack trying to get into a particular API, and then the increase in traffic is the success of that. So really good at visualizing data in the detective tool. The other thing that's really nice is your geolocation side of things. So here it's observed that previous locations were either on the East Coast or West Coast of the US. And then we have a newly observed location that came up in Sydney, Australia. And so it'll actually show you geolocation. So a lot you can do with Detective, could do a whole discussion on it, but just wanted to give you a brief preview there of what could be done. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about Azure. You're going to see a lot of similarities here. Azure Security Center is the Security Hub equivalent. It's going to bring all the various alerts from the Azure products into a common console, and then it will also have the configuration standards. So one of the struggles, though, with Microsoft's cloud, and it can be overcome, but it can be difficult to understand where different log events come from. And this is a really good graphic. As you can see, there are 6 different areas that you can get logs and alerts from in the Azure environment, depending on what tools you're using. So one of the struggles a lot of people have is in getting good monitoring and detection is where do I go to get this information? And as you can see, there's 6 different ways to get it. The nice thing is Security Hub allows you to consolidate this into a common location. Here's another screenshot of the Security Center. So you can see the top piece there is policy and compliance. Then it's security hygiene, and then it's threat protection. And I can drill down a little bit more on these. These are the regulatory compliance screen. This is the one you saw earlier. As I said before, we've got the CIS standard, we've got the PCI standard. pick what best fits for you. Don't have to do a single one. You can do multiple ones, but it gives you a quick at a glance of your overall compliance. I wouldn't feel great about 145 failed controls. And then it will allow you, as you can see there, the different tabs on the lower screen to drill into each one, to each category, down to the individual control. Now, many of you understand this, but when you apply these control environments out of the box, if you will, you're not going to be 100% compliant. And some of these controls may not work in your environment. So what you need to do is go in and tune these things. And there may be good reasons that certain controls will not be applicable or not be usable in your environment. This is a great way, though, to start off, get your initial benchmark, find out where you're not compliant, then make a determination if it makes sense to become compliant to that control, or simply remove that control from your tool here and really accept the risk to that. All right, so here are your security alerts, and you can get a feel for some of the different ones as they come in. Got a nice chart there. I think that the Azure product has some really good usability, but honestly, for most people, I think you're going to bring these alerts into Security Hub or Security Center, depending on whether you're using AWS or Azure, and then you're going to take them into a SIEM and or SOAR platform. And I'll talk about how to bring all these things together at the end of the presentation. Now, some of you may be familiar with CSPM solutions, Cloud Security Platform Management or Posture Management. There are many tools out there that will allow you to do management of your cloud environment. Many of them address cloud security management. And their big claim to fame is they can do it across multiple cloud platforms. That's great. And it was definitely a necessity a few years ago when we didn't have these tools from our cloud providers. And we needed to find a way to get control. Typically, I've seen the Dome 9 product, which is now owned by Checkpoint. Palo Alto now has their Prisma line. Which was, I always forget the name of where that company came from. And then VMware now has Cloud Health. So you can see some of the major players in our industry has gone out and acquired a CSPM product to help their customers manage it. And this is a viable solution. But I'd highly recommend looking at the native security products in Azure and AWS and even Google. Gartner put out a report not that long ago about cloud security posture management tools. And the one quote I wanted to share was, the standalone market for CSPM is unsustainable in their opinion. So there's a large number of vendors here. Many of these vendors are not going to be around in a year or two or three or whatever the time frame is. There's just not enough business out there for all of them, considering the fact that the cloud platforms are coming out with their own tools. So if you run a hybrid environment and you really want a consolidated tool, then I'd be careful and go with one of these that are owned by a larger organization. And I do not want to get into an evaluation of these products. They all essentially do what I've showed you today, as well as some additional things. But just understand that there are good native products available, and there's going to be a lot of turmoil, I think, in this industry as we go forward, because we can't sustain 20 different products or whatever that is there. So how would you bring this together? I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about that. So you've got AWS and Azure. Many of you run a multi-cloud platform. And how do you bring these alerts together? So quite a few of the SIM manufacturers out there, some of the SOAR platforms that are out there will allow you to bring these alerts in from Security Hub or Security Center into your SIM or SOAR platform. For us at Digital Hands, that's what we do. We use Security Center or Security Hub. We bring it into actually our SOAR platform. We match it to threat intel. And then we also bring it into our SIM platform, because you remember, you're going to have logging events coming in from your cloud host. So in order to do correlation, we bring those alerts into our SIM platform to correlate all the alerts together. And then it can be viewed by the security analyst. But both AWS and Azure are applying threat intelligence into their monitoring tools. We will do it again at the SIM and SOAR platform. And we get a lot of great information and being able to see how things match up with known indicators of compromise. And really where I believe this industry is going is not just the prevention and detection, but if you remember the slide that I showed about response, it is surprisingly easy to build response actions in AWS and Azure environments. And so when we see things occur, the ability to go out and block IOCs, URLs, IP addresses, remove users, change access control lists, these things are easily built with the tools that we have. AWS with Lambda functions, trigger a Lambda function, shut something down, block something. We can take action much faster than a human can in these types of scenarios. So the purpose of this presentation was really to focus on the prevention and detection, but there's a lot of great response actions that we can take with these native security tools. So I got a couple questions that have popped up. I wanted to keep the slides relatively brief, so we had plenty of time to get through any questions. In case you're wondering, that picture is Clearwater Beach. Digital Hands is based in the Tampa Bay area. If anyone's ever down this way, you're welcome to come see our Security Operations Center. So I had a question, which Azure AD subscription is this dashboard under? And it actually isn't tied back to your AD subscription. It's a standalone product that can be enabled in your Azure environment like AWS. I believe they give you a 30-day free trial to try the tool out. And so really pretty easy to get that tool up and running. Someone asked the acronym FAAS. That is, I think it's a function as a service is what that stands for. So you've got obviously infrastructure as a service. You've got software as a service. We're also seeing things now, functions or specific services that are being provided as a service. Just looking at what other questions we have here. All right. If anyone has any additional questions, please put it into the Q&A box. So I got a question. Would you recommend using one specific cloud vendor or being hybrid when implementing security in your organization? And that's a simple question that is very complex in answering. I've seen organizations, but before I worked with Digital Hands, I did a lot of consulting work. And I've seen organizations do both. I've seen where they standardize on AWS or Azure, and I've seen a lot of organizations that have a hybrid environment. Actually, I've seen more with a hybrid environment than one that was dedicated to one or the other. And the hybrid environment does introduce some complexities. As I mentioned earlier, there's some really good tools out there that will manage the hybrid environment. Dome 9 was one that I've seen a lot of customers utilizing very effectively. But I think that organizations can support a hybrid environment. Not at all unusual to see an organization using Azure from an Office 365 standpoint, Active Directory, more user-facing services, and then that same company using AWS for their external web applications, web-facing presence. And it introduces a little more complexity, but in my opinion, it's been manageable. All right, another question. Can these misconfigurations typically be corrected by customers, or do they require coordination with the cloud provider to correct? Those misconfigurations that we showed in the breach scenarios were all caused by those companies and how they configured their environments. So they were not an issue with an AWS or an Azure. That, if you remember back when Capital One breach, everyone got excited because they thought, well, maybe AWS has been breached. No, AWS hadn't been breached. It was the mistakes that was made by Capital One that allowed the AWS employee to get access. And it was a vulnerability, but it was a vulnerability that should have been addressed. Okay, good. Any other questions? Well, I hope this was of value to everyone. My goal was first and foremost to introduce you to the tools that were available in the AWS and Azure environment to secure your cloud environments, to share with you some of the past breaches. And as you can tell, the focus of this was very much, this is a human error. Most of those breaches were related to misconfigurations. And the good news is we have really great tools and standards available to us to prevent these types of attacks. So hopefully this information was helpful to everyone. And I believe we can probably wrap up with that. I appreciate the virtual claps at the end there. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you guys for attending. It was a pleasure to work with you today, Jeff. You did a great job. And again, thank you all for the virtual claps, because Jeff definitely deserves it. If you have any questions, Jeff will be around for a little while longer. Also, we have his contact information that is on the last slide, so please don't be afraid to reach out to him directly, and we will definitely go from there. So happy InfoSeCon Friday, and we'll stick around, but have a great day no matter what.
Yep. Have a great conference, everyone. just like a real physical conference. This is the equivalent of everyone walking out of the room right now.
I agree. I agree. I think you have another question that just popped up.
You said most of the common breaches occur due to human errors. So that have been, then the security analyst would have just oversaw the tool's warning of the issue. That's a really good point. And I don't have the intimate details of the breaches. I know Capital One identified that breach pretty fast, but you do bring up a good point with if they had the proper monitoring tools in place, they should have detected it. And most of those breaches, Capital One detected it themselves, Microsoft detected it themselves. The other one, I don't believe they did detect it themselves. So they probably did not have the right tools in place.
Anonymous. All right, we have another question.
Known issues with CASB. Yeah, that's a good question. CASB is another control that can be used. It focuses more on obviously access into the cloud. But most of the CASB products have gotten very heavy into DLP and protecting companies at a data level, which sounds great, but it's hard to implement. And so I think CASBs can be very effective for monitoring access into especially cloud applications. But I would be careful trying to do DLP unless your organization has a clear inventory and understanding of what is sensitive data and what isn't.
So I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So from what I was taught about security, it pretty much goes, there's a scale. You have security and you have convenience.
Yeah.
And you go between the both of them, or however your levels are. If you lean more towards a secure environment, is that something that companies should be afraid of, or why don't most companies lean in that direction? I
Mhm.
personally have seen breaches where I've seen someone literally pay out $500,000,
Mhm.
because of a spear phishing attack. I've seen I've seen one instance where someone paid out $75,000 once. The spammer got cocky and fished them again the same day and got
Yeah.
another $75,000. Which that was amazing. So if we all know that the tools are out here to secure environments, in many different ways, why aren't these companies really going in those directions? Why do
Yeah.
you think?
You hit on I think one of the big problems in security is you have to be able to support the business,
Hmm.
and it really starts there. And then you've got to be able to support the users, but you've got to be able to secure your environment. And it's really it really is all about risk and identifying risk, looking at how to mitigate those risks without impacting the business. And um, a lot of the problems over the years have occurred because the executives and the IT and the security people just aren't talking the same language. In a lot of your IT and security people don't know how to talk to the business about business risk. And the executives don't understand security. And so you see organizations that their growth is sometimes stifled because of, like, PCI. I was a PCI QSA for a long time, and I saw many organizations that would say, well, we can't do that because of PCI. That's not true. You have to be able to find a solution that is secure, that will support the business. And Um, it takes, first of all, communications between executives and security people and IT people, and they've got to be able to talk the same language, and they've got to be able to talk about business risk. So you see now, these massive ransomware attacks where, entire companies are shut down. And, it's a lot of times it's organizations that didn't make the investment in security because they didn't understand the risks that they face. So in my opinion, a lot of times it goes back to just simple communications issues.
Okay. It looks like we have a couple more questions. One
Yeah.
from Tom Stratton.
Yeah, for a business that's just starting up, would it be better to be a solely cloud structure or have a hybrid approach and have some on premise? I think a lot of organizations are going what's called cloud first. They're going to try to put everything they can in the cloud. Why own the hardware? Why own the operating systems? Why own even the software for that matter? Let someone else manage it. And go with a cloud first. And so for a new business, I would, the only thing I would buy would be endpoint devices, and I would try to run everything else in a cloud environment. And there are good security controls, as you've seen, that are fairly inexpensive or free in sometimes. And so I would go cloud first and try not to do anything on premise.
All right. And there's another question from Ed. How do local and state organizations balance the ratio of risk and IT budget? Kind
Yeah,
of.
that's an interesting one, and state and local governments become a favorite of ransomware organizations over the last couple of years because, quite frankly, they knew those organizations had limited budgets, um, and would be relatively easy targets. Um, the biggest thing I like to remind people, when I think of a state and local government, I'm going to immediately think of ransomware because of what's going on. Um, Ransomware has to exploit a vulnerability. It just doesn't magically encrypt a machine. It has to be able to exploit a vulnerability. So I would put a lot of emphasis on vulnerability management. Yes, security awareness training is important, but let's face it, these attackers are getting better and better and better, and people are still going to click on things. So try your best to remove the vulnerabilities that can be executed, and then look for a really, really good email spam and phishing filter.
Great.
Um, and there are some good ones out there. Um, and then back up, back up, back up, back up, and don't keep it in your network. Um, and so, there's a lot of controls out there that need to be addressed. But if I'm in a state and local government and I'm responsible for securing it, I'm really going to focus on those things first and foremost. And it's really what I said is look back at the breaches in your industry, and understand how your peers are being attacked. And that's where I would focus my time, effort, and money first. I've seen so many organizations sink money into projects that have nothing to do with how their industry is being attacked.
I definitely agree with that. Definitely agree with it. Interestingly enough, I live in Durham, North Carolina, and I purchased a condo earlier this year, and it got pushed back by 3 months specifically for that reason.
Oh yeah.
You know, and it's interesting to see that because you would think that local state governments, um, you shouldn't be vulnerable. You would
Mm.
assume that, uh, but at the end of the day, I think it just uh, all boils down to how much you can invest into your infrastructure. in your entire environment.
Agree.
All right. That was definitely a good presentation, Jeff. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I think we still have a few participants. If there's any other questions out there, if you guys can hear us, definitely please feel free to ask. We'll be live for about 5 more minutes, and it'll be a hard stop at 11 o'clock. So definitely, please feel free while you have Jeff available, ask away. All right. Kind of adding to your statement a few moments ago, having an organization invest in a good email filtering service. Are there any services that you and your organization may recommend, or certain qualities to look for in those services?
Yeah, a lot of organizations are running Microsoft Office 365 in the cloud.
Hmm.
Um, their email filtering, phishing is getting better and better. We went to a product from a company called Avanon, which integrates into Office 365. Um, Very, very strong um, solution, not just for email filtering, but really good at blocking phishing attacks, and also even has some DLP capabilities. So very
Okay.
similar to a CASB type solution. So
Okay.
um, that's helped us out internally tremendously, as well as a number of other organizations. We've recommended it to.
That sounds good. From one of my previous positions, I used to tell people, you don't click on anything, no matter what it is.
Mhm.
And I think Tom Stratton has another question. He says, for someone new to IT in general or interested in making a career in the cloud, what would you suggest as a way to begin?
Yeah, good question. Fortunately, there's some good initial free training available from both, especially from AWS, but also I think there is from Azure. Um, but I would go out and look at what AWS provides, what Microsoft provides for the free training, um, and pick one and then start down that road. And there's a big demand right now for people with cloud backgrounds and cloud certifications. And there's some good training. It's either free or relatively inexpensive to get through. So I would start with the cloud platform providers themselves.
I agree. I agree. All right. And Tom says, thank you very much.
Mm.
I think a lot of the professionals that I speak with, they agree and echo what you were saying. Cloud infrastructure, IT security, like right now is the perfect opportunity to get into those fields.
Mhm.
If there's a lot of videos out there, there's a lot of learning out there that's free or low cost, and a lot of employers will pay for it.
Right.
So definitely go in those directions. And if you're ready to jump into the cloud, so to speak, um, sky is the limit. No pun intended. All right. So, guys, it looks like we are coming up on our time right here. Um, Jeff, again, I want to thank you very much for sharing your presentation with us, just being
Enjoyed it.
here and your knowledge and experience. To everyone who attended, it's been a pleasure. Thank you guys for coming to InfoSeCon 2020.